Okay, welcome to our webinar, Understanding Carbon Capture and Storage Opportunities in Eastern Canada. My name is Carl Jeffrey from Carbon Capture Journal in London, and we're sponsored today by Decarb Connect, which is a platform for senior leaders in decarbonisation to support decision-making. Canada has been leading carbon capture developments for the past decade, including with Quest, which is has got the world's largest CO2 pipeline, and Boundary Dam, which is the world's first carbon capture facility on a coal-fired power plant. But all of these projects are in the west of the country. Quest is in Alberta and Boundary Dam is in Saskatchewan, and most of the Canadian population is in the east, so 38% in Ontario and 23% in Quebec. And there's lots of heavy industry in that part of the country, and perhaps we can do storage under the Great Lakes. But there's no carbon capture project so far, so that's what we're going to talk about today, the potential for carbon capture in Eastern Canada. Our first speaker today is Richard, or Dick Jackson. He's adjunct professor Earth and Environmental Sciences with the University of Waterloo, which is 70 miles west of Toronto, and he's fellow of Geofirma Engineering, which specializes in the subsurface. And he leads a group which has been discussing CCS projects in Ontario and recently designed a roadmap for carbon capture in southwest Ontario for the Canadian government. Our second speaker is Charles DeLand, Associate Director Research with the C.D. Howe Institute. He's based in Alberta, and he's written a report about CCS policy in Ontario and how to get projects going. So we've got two speakers who've written perhaps the only reports about carbon capture in Ontario. And our third speaker is Phil DeLuna, Chief Carbon Scientist and Head of Engineering with Deep Sky, based in Toronto, and they're working to build large-scale direct air capture and storage infrastructure in Canada, including Quebec. So the webinar is going to be an hour long. We'll have 3 presentations, about 10 minutes each, and there should be time for questions at the end. And you can put your questions in the Q&A box at any time. Our speakers can answer the question by typing if they want to, but it might be easier to take them all at the end. And I'd like to invite Dick to start his talk. Thanks.
Well, I hope you can see this.
Yep, that's good.
Okay, Carl?
So it's great. Yep, that's great.
Okay, fine. Yeah, my name is Dick Jackson. And what I want to talk to you about is this issue of what is going to be technically possible with respect to storage in Ontario. We have the 2030 emissions reduction plan from Environment and Climate Change Canada, published last year, which indicates that there is a credible path, or it maps out a credible path to emissions reductions 40% lower by 2030 than in 2025. This is from the foreword written by Minister Stephen Gilbert. Now, as Carl mentioned, Ontario is often conflated with the rest of Canada as a leader in the first generation of global CCS development. This is James Miller speaking this summer in the Financial Post in July, talking about Canada as being a leader. Really, to be honest, it's really Western Canada as a leader. And Western Canada is a leader because of experience in the 1990s with acid gas disposal wells and sequestration. Acid gas being CO2 and SO2. And the Alberta oil patch got a lot of experience how to safely sequester acid gas. So it wasn't a huge jump to go to CO2 storage because it was just a simpler case. Now, it's far more accurate to look at Ontario's situation with this quote from Clean Prosperity, saying that dozens of industrial decarbonization projects are yet to be built to meet that 2030 target. And in order to be operational, many of these projects realistically require final investment decisions within the next 24 months. I would say sooner than that. But let's just take that as gospel right now. Here are our $2 billion investments Sask Power's Boundary Dam 3 unit with the carbon capture unit shown in the bottom right of the figure. This is the upper figure, the carbon capture unit, and Shell Quest's carbon capture unit shown here at the Scottsford refinery north of Edmonton in the bottom figure. Now, to accomplish 40% CO2 reduction, we've got to consider technology readiness and financial incentives for CCS. The technology is ready, as shown in these $2 billion, well, the replacement costs for these will be $1 billion units. I think they're pretty well close to $1 billion each. Now, so the technology is ready, at least for carbon capture. Secondly, we need to look at the locations of emitters and storage sites, which in Western Canada are not close, but within 100 kilometers. That's the same in Ontario. Third, we need to look at the time required to plan and construct CCS once you have a regulatory framework. Unfortunately, we're lacking a regulatory framework so far in Ontario. Now let's look at the principal emitters. They're gathered along the Great Lakes, which may be important in future for collection. Now, they're stretched from Algoma Steel way up in the Sioux to the large complex of oil refining, petrochemical, fertilizer plants down around Sarnia. And then there are the steel plants in Hamilton, Nanticoke, oil refineries in Nanticoke, and cement plants that are distributed from the central part around Woodstock in southwestern Ontario, along the north shore of Lake Ontario. I'm just going to omit discussion of utilities, just look at the 19 plus million tons of CO2 that is produced by the manufacturing subsector. The largest piece of the pie is iron and steel, with about 37% of the 19.4 million tons, followed by oil refining, followed by chemicals, petrochemicals, fertilizers, and around 15% is cement and lime manufacturing. Smaller but very important sectors are food and beverage and the auto assembly plants, which only amount to about 2.5% of CO2 emissions. And those are probably centered in the paint plants in the attached to the auto assembly plants. Now, we have CSA guidelines for geological CO2 storage. These were developed mainly in Alberta from the acid gas storage facilities because of the similarity of the problem. And the first one is the storage must be greater than 800 meters deep to allow supercritical CO2 to be injected. So that's going to put us around about injection pressures of greater than 9 MPa. Second one is the reservoir into which this supercritical CO2 is injected. Item 1 must be sealed with a competent cap rock, so there's no leakage to the cap rock, with minimal groundwater inflow from the surrounding rock. Then there are 3 or 4 very desirable features, such as near major CO2 emitters and pipelines or pipeline right-of-ways, penetrated by relatively few legacy oil and gas wells. There are still quite a few active oil and gas wells in Ontario, maybe about 3,000. Preferably the reservoir into which we're going to inject the CO2 has a large pore volume available for CO2 storage. So there will be a limited pressure increase as the CO2 is injected into the reservoir and has to displace the brine that is already in the reservoir. And that brine is going to resist displacement. So we want to have plenty of pore volume available. And finally, we don't want there to be any critically stressed faults in the reservoir that might slip with fluid injection, CO2 injection, and cause felt earthquakes. Now, in Ontario, the target horizon is here. This is actually in southeastern Ontario, shown where the Cambrian sandstone is exposed near Kingston, overlying the Precambrian basement. This photo taken by Bruce Hart of Western University shows the tan-colored Cambrian sandstone above the top of that road sign. That's the contact between the tan sandstone and the Precambrian bedrock beneath it. So the Precambrian bedrock is what you see up in cottage country. Now, what we need is a good thickness of this Cambrian sandstone, but buried beneath at least 800, preferably a kilometer of other sedimentary rocks. And that is only along the north shore of Lake Erie. And this figure, this is an isopack map showing the thickness of the Cambrian formation. Unfortunately, the Cambrian is just not pure sandstone. It is a mix of sandstone and dolomite. But you can see here, the black dots show how this figure was created. There are wells that went down to the Cambrian, or at least to the overlying caprock. And you can see that the Cambrian is about 50 meters thick along the, more or less along the shoreline, the northern shoreline of Lake Erie. And it gets quite a bit thicker offshore. And this is why some have posited that we might inject offshore. There are no regulations allowing that right now. That's Crown land, probably Ontario Crown land, but maybe the federal government has a say there as well, because these are boundary waters. As you can see, there is the US-Canada boundary running right through Lake Erie there. Now, these rocks dip northwards because CO2 is buoyant. Any injection into the sediments beneath the lake should move northwards, but the initial drilling will probably be along on land somewhere between that 50 and 100 meter isopack contour. This is about a 1-year-old map, and it has been revised since, but I can't show you the revision. So that's our target. Now, those boundary dam and the Scottsford Quest facilities would cost $1 billion today to reproduce. And so we're looking at investments of over $1 billion when you consider the pipelines and the storage sites as well. Now, we can't get investment decisions of that order until we've proven volumetric estimates for CO2 storage. And that has to be proven by drilling and testing and seismic using rigs like this brought in from Alberta, followed by numerical simulation of CO2 migration and pressure development within the reservoir. Cost per borehole will be 3 to 5 million, depending on how much testing, both in the field in situ and in the lab you want done. You'll need 2 boreholes to estimate reservoir transmissivity, the permeability times thickness, and the compressibility, how the pressure response will respond. And so each well hub with 2 or 3 wells and seismic and pipelines and proximal pipelines and perhaps buffer storage are going to cost you 30 million at least. Now, so can we develop CCS in southwestern Ontario by 2030? Well, we're going to be drilling down about a kilometer down to the Cambrian, which is shown here at the bottom of these yellow lines. The existing gas fields are typically at about 400 meters depth, will be down at around about a kilometer depth, but there are exploratory boreholes and some old legacy wells that will have to be plugged at that depth. In southwestern Ontario, I estimate in the roadmap we'll need to prove about 10 million tons for annual CO2 storage, 10 million tons a year by 2025 to allow planning and construction to begin storage by 2030. It doesn't look like we're going to make the 2025 deadline. Here's the timeline for CO2 storage in Ontario. Given, well, on the right end, we'll pick 2030 as our deadline. It's, it's an objective, it's a goal, it's not a mandatory deadline, but the federal investment tax credits that I'm sure Charles is going to be talking to you next about, they are due to decrease by half after 2030. So we can start the clock ticking in 1996 when the Norwegian oil company Equinor, or Statoil as it then was, began offshore drilling and sequestration in the North Sea into the a sandstone beneath the North Sea. In 2004, we had a report here from the University of Waterloo that indicated there was a possibility we could do it in southwestern Ontario in the area I've shown you. In 2006, provincial government brought in experts from Alberta to talk about CO2 sequestration and issued a report in 2007. At that time, it appears that the provincial government decided to shut down coal-fired burning power plants, and OPG obliged, taking 20 million tons off the table, a huge reduction in CO2 emissions. And then the provincial government appears to have prohibited CO2 injection in about 2010. But things started really rolling out west. And so in 2012, Shell got approval for the Quest project, and Boundary Dam moved ahead with projects EOR and dedicated CCS storage. So they both started up around 2015. And then we kind of go on during this, what is called the lost decade, with Quest and Boundary Dam both capturing about 1 million tons each, Boundary Dam a little less, maybe 600,000 tons a year, and nothing was happening in Ontario. Finally, in 2023, in March of this year, the government lifted the prohibition on CO2 injection. And this summer, work began to design a framework, a regulatory framework for commercial scale carbon capture and storage on Crown and private land. But it might be another 2 years before that framework comes into law. So that leaves us desperately short of time to do site characterization storage sites. If we prove a site, only then can the pipeline, the midstream companies start designing pipelines and building them, costing them. And there's going to be cost analysis and final investment decisions made thereafter, and then construction. It's an awfully short time. So the challenge is this: we got 10 years of work to be done in 6 to meet the 2030 deadline. The province has not yet established a regulatory framework. Assuming in CO2 injection rates of no more than 200 kilotons of CO2 per well per year, to inject 10 million tons, we'll need 40 or 50 injection wells. The first one was drilled in 2022. None have been drilled since. And we're going to need 6 years to plan and permit develop CCS following successful storage pilot test. And then we will need more than one hub. So we are behind. I've outlined the problem in this roadmap. And if you want to get a copy of it, please just email me and I'll send it to you. But that's the situation in Ontario.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Dick. That's great. Yeah, the question in the Q&A box is there exploratory drilling already planned? I think you answered that in your last slide. No, I think it hasn't. But we'll go
Well,
on to Charles DeLand now. I think he's going to give us the policy perspective. So we'll go to Alberta and hear from Charles. Cheers.
Sure. Thanks, Carl, and a great introduction, Dick. You really covered a lot of it here. So thanks for having me. I'm Charles DeLand, and I'm Associate Director for Research at the C.D. Howe Institute, and I lead the Energy and Natural Resources Policy Research. We're based in Toronto, although I am based in Calgary. A little blurb for what we do. We're a registered charity, independent, not-for-profit research institute, whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. And we've been around for about 60 years. We're quite influential. We subject all our research to anonymous review, which distinguishes us from some of our competitors, and we are nonpartisan and evidence-based, and we offer advice on monetary policy, fiscal tax policy, competition policy, and human capital, healthcare, international economics, and more. So for this, while I'm not a technical expert, a geologist, I can offer some thoughts on where Ontario is in their path for CCS. In the summer, I co-authored a paper that talked about a little bit of this and what Ontario can do to catch up. And why does time matter? Well, Dick touched on it quite well. The scale of the problem, for one. Canada's going to need to increase our rates of CO2 captured and stored probably between 12 and 15 times from 2021 levels to hit the 2050 targets, according to the Canada Energy Regulator's recent release Canada Energy Futures project. And this is going to be probably a critical tool, CCS, to reduce the emission intensity of economically critical parts of the Canadian economy, like steel, cement, petrochemical production, refining, fertilizer, pulp and paper, power generation. So these are critical to Ontario's economy and to Canada's by extension. Two projects take a long time to build. They often take 7 years to plan, build, and complete, maybe 10. And then the time also matters for the eligibility of the tax credit. So to make it cheaper and more attractive for this actually to take place. Today, Ontario is not eligible for the federal investment tax credit for geological storage, and this is because it does not have an established regulatory regime. At the moment, BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan are eligible. And just to underscore the incentives, that they are time limited. So that right now there's a 50% investment tax credit for capturing storage and 37.5 for the transportation and storage and use. This gets cut in half by 2030 and ends at 2041 at the moment. So you're already half as good in only 6.5 years. So there's also a one for direct air capture, which perhaps Phil will talk to. So that outlines for today. I'll just background a little bit where we are, some of the problems, and some recommendations. A hint toward the recommendations. First, I guess maybe obviously establish a regulatory framework so that proponents can actually take advantage of the incentives from the government of Canada. And related to this, vest the saline aquifer pore space with the Crown to maximize the benefit. So the government of Ontario appears to be taking quite a cautious step-by-step approach. I would say overly cautious, editorializing. They have published a roadmap toward regulating storage, which outlines the major steps. And on April, they published Bill 91, the Less Red Tape, Stronger Economy Act, which has a number of proposed changes to the Oil, Gas, and Salt Resources Act to regulate projects and to test and demonstrate new and innovative projects such as geological carbon storage. And now in September of this year, they posted a discussion paper with regulatory provisions for, quote, special projects, including carbon storage. And they define these special projects as projects that are to test, assess, pilot, or demonstrate an activity method that is new or innovative to Ontario. Carbon storage is one example. And they've posted sort of a brief outline of what these special projects could be. There's a two-step project. One, you'd have to do an application for a special project designation with detailed plans, description, activities. And then there's step two, application for the wells and injection permits, including a lot of geological work, geographical boundaries, all assets, the storage complex, other structures, rights and interests, sort of legal, a full consultation plan, risk assessment. It's quite onerous. There's other documentation needed, as well as financial security for risk. So initially, this is all to take place on private land. So it's not, Crown land is not eligible. So there needs to be more legislative changes before Crown land is considered. So right now, Ontario, our view, or my view rather, on biggest issues and recommendations. One, a bigger and better long-term vision and to clarify the decision points. And this is related to investment. Large investments need policy certainty. Without it, no one's going to spend millions or billions of dollars. So while Ontario has published the timeline and the roadmap, the vision's a little muddy. As Dick talked about, even in the best case, we're talking about 2025 of when this thing will be up and running, the regulatory regime. And there's a lot of questions still. So I think we need more detail of what the final vision is and work backward for there. Where are the risks? It seems a bit piecemeal at the moment. So the government, for one, relating to the comment about the private and public tracks of inquiry, there's sort of a private pilot project that we have here, but also there's questions about the Crown land. Ultimately, that will have to be merged, because if you really want to talk about saline aquifers, they underlie both. So you need to have something that's going to work for both types of land. There's no delineations geologically. The current special projects approach in the current consultation could be less onerous. It's very heavy duty for what are essentially pilot projects. There's just a lot of caution here. Now, it's not unusual in full large-scale projects that you see. For example, the Shell Quest would have had to go through this, and rightly so, but they are very costly in time and money. So for this, we would recommend sort of a slimmed down version, some sort of evaluation permit to do testing with a limited breadth of activities, such as just drilling. And this is often seen in places with oil and gas extraction, where there's a less onerous process, but also you don't get to do as much. But it's for testing it and checking out the geology and making sure that these can be actually done. Third, and I think maybe the biggest thing, is that clarifying the pore space ownership. Right now, the current policy restricting the projects is to private lands, and it may impede the development of commercial scale CCS. There isn't a clear policy on who owns the pore space and who has rights to it. Much of the aquifer pore space, which may be suitable, appears to lie under Crown land, under the Great Lakes. One option, which I think we'd recommend, is to do what Alberta did in 2010 and BC announced it's doing in 2022, is clarifying the ownership of the pore space, which is specifically declaring it to be vested in the name of the Crown. Because the saline aquifers are continuous and they cover subsurface areas of very large tracts of land with multiple landowners, both private and Crown. It's not practical or feasible for the proponents to acquire the necessary pore space without the government intervention. So the government has to be involved in any way, and doing it piece by piece and individual negotiations is not really workable. And you see this from other jurisdictions, again with major subsurface, either mining or oil and gas. We have this sort of thing. You need sort of a single regulator to make decisions to optimize the either extraction or storage of materials. So a single owner who can establish consistent conditions for access and the public interest. So I think it would be relatively easily done. So in Alberta in 2010, this had to be put in place for things like the Shell project, and there was some concern beforehand that it would unleash lawsuits and that sort of thing. But really, it went relatively smoothly there, because this isn't used for other purposes. There's not a lot of competing economic interests. So to declare it as Crown land, and I mean subsurface land, not surface, is, I think, it makes a lot of sense. And we're not, it wouldn't impact other extraction or activities for minerals at the current time. So fourth would be long-term liability. And there's still a lot of questions about who actually would own the liability, if any, from stored carbon dioxide or emissions rather. Right now in Alberta, after I think it's 20 years, the province assumes responsibility for that. That gives an exit point for a proponent to say that. Now that assumes you've followed all the rules, you've done all the work, but that gives you, it's not unlimited, it's not forever, some obligation. So it increases the policy certainty that a proponent will understand where their obligation ends, and that's taken over then by the Crown, the government, in a sense. So I think more clarity on that for Ontario would be useful. Right now, it seems as though the government's not likely to go this way, but they want to direct this to some sort of third-party insurance. But this poses risks because there's not really an end line or a timeline to monitor the CO2, and it may increase costs and uncertainty for the project. And I think just finally on this, generally speaking, use other jurisdictions as models where possible. So these are not unique to Ontario. Many of them have been dealt with in Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC, but also other jurisdictions with resource extraction, because essentially many of the rules, regulations are the same when things are stored as when they're extracted. So there's lots of things, no need to reinvent the wheel, as the cliche goes. So that's my advice here, and just to move more quickly, I think the time is running out, and there's not necessarily the caution needed that seems to be displayed here. So I think that's a high-level presentation here for what we've looked at here. I want to acknowledge the International CCS Knowledge Center here is a great resource. They're based in Regina. They have a bunch of people in Calgary and elsewhere. If you're not aware, they're aggregating best practices technically, but also for regulation. They're very helpful and knowledgeable folks. So, so thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you very much, Charles. Yeah, as a Brit, it's very odd to hear you use the phrase crown, because I think the Crown is Buckingham Palace is a few miles from here, but I don't think they have anything to do with it somehow.
Right. Yeah, I should have clarified. That's shorthand for publicly owned.
Yeah, I thought it might be. That's great. Well, we're going to Phil DeLuna now. So Phil is with it's our third speaker with Chief Scientist and Head of Engineering with Deep Sky, based in Toronto, working on direct air capture. And he told me they had some projects in Montreal. So it'd be interesting to hear how you get the legislative part of that to go, as well as the technology. But pass to Phil, cheers.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me first. And I learned so much from both Dick and Charles. So thank you both for your previous presentations. And I couldn't agree more with you that each jurisdiction really needs to just learn from each other and then speed up this process, because there's value at stake, not only from a climate perspective, but an economic perspective, that every day we delay, we lose out on that value. So I'm here to tell you a little bit more about Deep Sky. We are a carbon removals project developer, and we're technology agnostic, meaning that we're focused not necessarily on building the tech to capture carbon from the air or from the ocean, but rather on building the projects and the infrastructure around it, which also includes subsurface storage or sequestration, both or including in situ mineralization, ex situ mineralization, and injection. Now, the injection in Quebec is not yet regulated. Quebec is also another province that doesn't have the regulatory regime and also doesn't qualify for the CCUS ITC, the tax credit. But we're hoping and we're working very closely with the Quebec government to change that. So the story of Deep Sky begins with our co-founders, Fred Lalonde and Joost Overkerk. They co-founded a company called Hopper many years ago, which is a travel app company. It's a $5 billion tech unicorn based in Montreal. A few years ago, they started offsetting the emissions of their customers by planting trees. They planted 30 million trees over 3 years, and they thought they were doing a really great job. But then when they started looking into climate, they realized a couple of things. First is that planting trees is not enough. They're not permanent. They literally will go up in smoke, as evidenced by the Canadian summer, and they're not fast enough for the scale that we need. And two, we need to start building the infrastructure to remove carbon dioxide from the air and from our oceans now, if we have any chance of getting it to reach the scale that it needs to be by 2030, 2040, 2050, and beyond. And so Deep Sky was born. And really, I'm going to skip all of the climate stuff. I think you all know that things are looking dire. Everything that we've tried to do so far has failed to significantly stem the tide of emissions. The sea is literally boiling and the Antarctic ice sheet is melting. We're talking 6 sigma, 4 sigma events, far beyond the norm. So what are we? We are a Quebec state-backed gigaton scale CO2 removal commercial venture. And why do we say state-backed? Because our biggest investors are the Quebec provincial government via Investissement Quebec, which is the venture capital arm of Quebec. Why does that matter? Because the ministry that owns Investissement Quebec also owns Hydro-Quebec. And we're in conversations right now to get dedicated power and renewable power for our carbon removal projects. But really, it all starts with renewable energy. We can't be doing carbon removals if it's not fueled by renewables. It makes no sense to burn natural gas to capture carbon dioxide from the air. It's much better that we should be doing point source and capture on all heavy emissions. But even if we were to do heavy emission, or even if we were to cap the emissions of the country today, we still have baked in temperature increases because there's a delay between emission and temperature rise, anywhere from 10 to 60 degrees, or 10 to 60 years, I should say. So even if we were to shut off all the taps tomorrow, we're continuing to increase our temperatures. We need to actually remove emissions from our atmosphere. And we believe our thesis is that we actually have to remove historical emissions and get down to the 360, 350 parts per million at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And we need to do this, and we need to do it using renewable energy. So the first step is renewable energy. The second step is capture. Now, what we're doing is we're partnering with leading capture technologies, and we're technology agnostic. So that's electrochemical, solid sorbent, liquid capture, whichever. We're evaluating all the different startup companies out there with different technologies for both direct air capture and direct ocean capture. Because even if you capture a CO2 from the air, you also have to capture CO2 from the ocean because of degassing and Henry's law. The CO2 that's embedded in the ocean will just degas into the air as well. So we have to do both at the same time. Once we capture the CO2, we need to do geologic storage. And that can be either, as I said, ultramafic injection in situ, that could be ex situ mineralization, or that could be injection into deep saline aquifers, which exist in the St. Lawrence. And then finally, our business model is we will generate credits and sell them onto the marketplace. First, the voluntary carbon market, but we have a strong belief that eventually governments will start procuring these as well, as evidenced by the DOE's $35 million pilot program to purchase carbon removals in the United States. So in Quebec, we have an abundance of hydro capacity, much of which is actually curtailed. Now that excess capacity will decrease over time as there's going to be more competition, as everyone is implementing heat pumps and everyone is driving around in their Teslas. We need to find energy efficient ways and lowest energy per ton of CO2 technologies to capture carbon from the air and the ocean. But even once all of that renewable capacity or low carbon capacity from hydro is exhausted, Quebec also has some of the highest onshore wind density in North America, if not in some parts of the world. You can get the same amount of wind density offshore, onshore in Northern Quebec. So on the capture side of things, we've been evaluating many different direct air capture technologies. We just announced a partnership last week or 2 weeks ago with Mission Zero to pilot their electrochemical CO2 capture, direct air capture technology, and pilot it in Quebec, in Montreal. We're also doing this with ocean capture as well. We announced our project with Captura. We're going to be bringing their pilot to the St. Lawrence, right where the salinity starts to become ocean. And we're going to be doing a direct ocean capture technology as well. On the storage side, realistically, it's going to take a couple of years at least to do all of the geologic modeling, all of the core well test drilling, all of this, the great work that's $30 million that Dick talked about earlier, as well as for the regulatory regime in Quebec to catch up to allow for deep saline aquifer storage. So in the meantime, we are working with an ex situ mineralization partner called Xterra, where we're going to be mineralizing our initial alpha facility carbon captured CO2 in ex situ mineralization in asbestos mine tailings in Quebec. At the same time, we're looking at potential for ultramafic rocks in the BTB region for in situ mineralization, similar to what Carbfix is doing in Iceland. Quebec is one of the best places in the world to do direct air capture and direct ocean capture for a few reasons. One, we have an excess of renewable electricity, hydro capacity, and all of that is in the north, which is very far away from population centers, very different from other places. Nowhere else do you have electricity generation so far away from where everyone lives, which is the south. But this means that you have these thick electricity and transmission wires that go right above areas that could be have potential for in situ mineralization, basaltic rocks in the BTB region up north. At the same time, we also have potential for saline aquifer storage in the St. Lawrence lowlands and access to water. Ontario's, in the grand scheme of things, actually for Canada, you can imagine in 2050, we have all of the capacity for storage in the West. And so we like to think of ourselves as an oil and gas company in reverse. Imagine a future where we use the renewables and the capacity of the East to capture carbon dioxide from our air and our oceans. And then we use existing pipelines, like, for example, the TC pipeline, to pipe that carbon dioxide back to the West and store it underground where we have more than enough storage potential in the long term. Now, of course, this is a grand scheme vision, but this highlights why Canada specifically has all of the ingredients to do gigaton scale and thousands of gigatons of CO2 capture, storage, and sequestration from both direct air and also point source. Now, of course, what's driving all this is carbon pledges from many different companies, many of which are not going to be able to meet their 2030, 2050 goals. And we're seeing the demand from premium removal carbon credits grow. Never have I seen a market where the demand and the supply is so imbalanced. And so what we're doing is we want to deliver the world's most robust carbon removal credits. We anticipate that as a society, as a species, we have to remove around 819 gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere by 2100. And so the first steps along that journey is a few projects that we're developing. The first is Deep Sky Alpha, which will be our testing and validation center, where we're going to co-locate different pilot projects of different capture technologies to understand which ones work in our environment, our temperature, our pressure, our humidity, and that'll be located in Montreal East. At the same time, we're going to be building Deep Sky 1, which will be our first commercial facility at about 300,000 tons per year. And right now we're doing the subsurface geologic surveying and identifying where we're going to be drilling test wells in order to identify regions in Quebec to do subsurface storage. And we are being technology agnostic means not only from the capture side, but also on the storage side. In the short term, I've already talked about mine tailing mineralization, ex situ mineralization with Xterra. We've pre-purchased the first 1,000 tons of their capacity, which will be what we are hoping to bring online for our Deep Sky Alpha facility. But in Deep Sky 1, we're going to be looking at all different kinds of technologies, and we'll be doing a combination of saline aquifer injection, mineralization, in situ and ex situ mineralization as well. So Deep Sky Alpha is going to be our iconic showcase of CDR technology. It's going to be our research lab, as well as a place where we're going to co-locate and co-host multiple DAC pilots with a shared balance of plant and CO2 post-processing for transportation to our storage facility, which will be in the Thetford Mines or Val de Source region with Xterra. Deep Sky 1 is going to be our commercial facility. We're hoping to build a 100,000 ton per year ocean capture, 200,000 ton per year direct air capture, and all of this will be done again as close as possible to the storage, the subsurface storage that we have in Montreal, or in Quebec, I should say. We are close to announcing a $75 million Series A raise, which is going to pay for Deep Sky Alpha and the exploration for where we're going to put Deep Sky 1. But then very quickly, once we show and prove out and close the loop for Deep Sky Alpha, we're going to be raising infrastructure capital and financing for Deep Sky 1. So we're actively looking for direct air capture, direct ocean capture companies who can deliver a pilot in 2024. We have partnered with the X Prize, the Carbon Removal X Prize, and we are offering $1 million in prototyping and licensing deals to X Prize teams that show promise and could potentially be piloted at our Alpha facility, with the potential to scale their technology for Deep Sky 1. So that's basically what Deep Sky is trying to accomplish. We are hoping to be, one of the most advanced, if not the most advanced technology agnostic project developer for carbon removals in the world. So I'll stop my presentation there. Thank you.
Wow, well, thank you very much. And we'll go to the Q&A session. So there's a question come in from my friend Kevin Dale, who's with Carbon Manager of Sasol, based in London. He's picked up on the thing that caught my attention as well. I don't know, Charles, you want to turn your camera on as well? This pipeline going across to Saskatchewan. We don't actually have any pipeline engineers on the panel, but I mean, I was kind of stunned that, that none of this work started with storage characterization yet, and this takes years. I mean, detailed characterization. I don't know if this is a plausible idea or if you have any pipelines that can go all the way to Saskatchewan. I don't know, maybe we go to Dick and Charles. I don't know if you've seen this this idea before. Do you think it's plausible at all? Or is it...
I'll let Dick answer first. Yeah, he's got his hand up there. Yeah.
Well, sorry. On land, the rule of thumb is in Southern Ontario, 3.5 to 4 million Canadian dollars per kilometer. If you're getting into an urban environment, that can increase quite rapidly. But I hope that somehow.
The pipeline's already there, perhaps. I don't know.
Maybe to just answer this really quickly, that figure that I showed, that map of Canada, that's a big picture vision, and that pipeline that already exists is the TC pipeline that ships natural gas from the west to the east. So presumably, in a future scenario where carbon removals has reached scale 2050 and beyond, all is to say that we already move gases from the west to the east. In the future, could we imagine a world where we move CO2 from the east to the west?
I'll just add a little bit from Alberta's perspective, or the West anyway. What we have now, there's a couple of projects. There's the Pathways Alliance, which is a bunch of oil sands producers that are getting together, and they're planning a hub system where you will have pipelines to move the captured CO2 to a central or a number of places where the storage capacity is very good. So that's in advance, and they're planning to use existing rights of ways to keep costs down as low as possible. I believe, I'm not sure if they're actually using, I think the pipelines are mostly in use at the moment, so there will be some construction needed. Now this is regional, not across the country. So I can't speak to that, the whole part of it. Obviously it is very expensive to build entirely dedicated pipelines if they're not already in use.
Wow, yeah, there's some comments from Arjun Brem, who LinkedIn tells me is a structural geologist in Ontario, so he's picking out the problems with the St. Lawrence River. So I've just got Google Maps up. I guess that's so I don't know that much about Canadian geology, but I can see that goes through Quebec. So he's quibbling your idea that you can put it under. This is probably for the geologists on the panel, Dick. I don't know, but people don't know where you can put it, where you can't put it. You're on mute at the moment, by the way.
In Quebec, the IRNS, the Quebec Research Center, has done some really very extensive work in the St. Lawrence lowlands onshore near Bécancour, and showed that there is a good thickness of the sandstone, same one I showed you, the Potsdam, what's called the Potsdam sandstone, but it's very less permeable in Quebec. But if you're going to be using direct air capture, you're not extracting a huge amount of CO2 annually, maybe 50 to 100 kilotons per year. So there is even though the permeability, the transmissivity is low, and even though there's lots of faulting there, because you got such good thickness, it's quite possible that you can succeed. The problem you have with any saline aquifer project is that the storage efficiency, the actual amount of the pore volume that gets used, is very small to begin with. After 15 years at Sleipner, the amount of the pore volume they were actually able to access was only 5% of the pore volume. That's not 5% of the reservoir, it's 5% of the pore volume. And that's because you're injecting a low viscosity buoyant fluid into a dense brine. And it's a very inefficient process. And that's why people have to look at things like extracting some of the brine to let the CO2 go in more easily. But yes, you probably, Charles, Phil is probably quite right to say they can use the St. Lawrence lowlands, the sedimentary rocks beneath there, to do direct air capture, because relatively small volumes compared with what comes out of a steel or cement plant are involved with direct air capture.
Okay, so we've got a question from Peter Badgley, who's with Stelco, which is a Canadian steel company. You probably know he's the Vice President of Technology, but he's asking about storing it in Nova Scotia. So I'll just bring it up on my map to see how far that is from Quebec. It's quite a long way away, but is that anybody got any thoughts about another big long pipeline? Is it? I mean, it's quite
I actually
shocking.
wasn't aware that there was a storage complex off of Nova Scotia. Did Charles or Dick?
Well,
do you
there's
know?
oil and gas production, I think, not a storage. I think.
Yeah, I don't know much about. I mean, there was gas production offshore Nova Scotia,
Yeah.
which is tailed off, but I don't know much more than that.
Offshore Nova Scotia and offshore Newfoundland are kind of the gleam in the eye of the federal government for 2050. That there is the possibility that there might be shipment of CO2 by pipeline, or perhaps even pressurized Great Lake shipping to Montreal, and then transfer to ships to take it offshore, where there is some good prospects of sub-seabed storage in areas that have been gas producers or oil producers in the past. That has been explored by a group in Halifax called Net Zero Atlantic, and it is a good prospect. It will take time, though, and a lot of capital to develop.
Well, I've just looked up Ellen Handyside on LinkedIn. I see she's a policy analyst with a stakeholder management and carbon management policy at Natural Resources Canada. So 2 questions. Well, for Phil, she wants to know, is 100 kilotons the storage capacity of the Thetford mines tailings? And for Dick, she'd like to know, should you consider mine tailings storage ultramafic mineralization? I don't know anything about Thetford mines. We should go to Phil first. Is that something?
Yeah, so I don't have the exact number of the storage capacity of the Thetford mine tailings. It's significant, but I can get back to you on the exact amount.
Oh, and Dick, do you want to answer the question about whether mine tailings storage are good for carbon too? Do you?
Well, it may be possible up north where there is CO2 generation around the various mining camps and pulp and paper mills. It may be possible. The big emitter in northern Ontario is Algoma Steel, and they are not looking at that as an option. They're looking at biochar and switching, fuel switching. So it's maybe in Northern Ontario. I'm not qualified to say.
Oh, that's great. There's a question for Carla. Can we get copies of the slides? So we'll provide a video to everyone, unless I get any objections from the speakers. But that's what we're planning to do. I mean, it's just an observation for me. What I've seen around the world is people normally find CO2 storage wherever they look for it, but it's far easier to do it when it's not underneath people's homes, or in the US, people get paid, I think, when stuff gets stored under their houses. So anywhere in the world, anywhere else in the world, like Germany can't do it very easily because they don't have the sea. But I don't know, perhaps Dick, we'll come to the last few minutes now, but I mean, it seems like there hasn't been much looking for it done in Ontario. But I mean, from experience in the rest of the world, I'll be quite optimistic that there'll be some found when there was money put into exploring for it. What do you think? Or was that false optimism?
No, I think that there are good prospects in the area I showed you along the north shore of Lake Erie. They have to be developed. That means more boreholes, more testing, more seismic work, and leading to ultimately pilot scale testing of CO2 injection to prove the storage. Once that's done, then the pipeline people can start making plans and perhaps use existing rights of way to plan for CO2 transmission.
Oh, very good. So we've got a question at Sushi Canada for Phil. So I'm looking at Atsushi, Business Development Manager at NGK. I think they make things you put inside direct air capture. So are you going to select one technology, or are you going to use multiple technologies? Is that answer that one?
It's a great question. We're going to ideally every technology that we pilot works. We know that's not going to be true. And there are many reasons for that. Some may not work in the temperature ranges or humidity. Some may freeze. Some may be too energy intensive. Some may not be scalable. But we're not going to figure that out until we start building things and trying. And I think that entire industry is waiting for something and people to do this. So we need to go do this. It's not like the X Prize or a competition where we're only going to pick one winner and then scale it. The reason that we're looking at multiple technologies is because by having a diversified portfolio of technologies, you de-risk the overall project. And this is true for an investment. If you're doing an investment in stocks, you want a diversified portfolio. And some of them may work better at some times of the year versus others in various conditions. So let's try to scale as many as possible so that as a whole, that 300,000 tons per year that Deep Sky 1 will be, we'll have a better chance of delivering and retiring all of that. And I'll also answer Richard's question about, DAC is known to be more energy costly than point source capture. Why bother with it? I mean, this is a really good question. We have to do both, right? And I know that lots of folks have said this analogy, but I love it and I'll use it anyway. When your tub is overflowing, you do two things. You turn off the tap and then you drain, you pull the drain. Point source emissions, we have to turn off the tap and of course we have to reduce our emissions, but there's already a delay in the emissions, in the temperature rise and the emissions that we put into the atmosphere. What we're feeling today are the emissions of 10 and 20 years ago. If we were to completely shut off everything today, we would still have those baked in temperature increases. So we need to remove at the same time, and we're never going to get down in cost if we don't start deploying and getting down the learning curve. To that specific point, a lot of the DAC technologies, what I call generation 1 DAC, which uses natural gas or high temperature like carbon engineering or Climeworks or a global thermostat, are all different versions of either solid sorbent or liquid sorbent that use heat. The technologies we're piloting at Deep Sky Alpha are all technologies that rely on only electricity and have the potential of being up to 1,000 kilowatt hours per ton of CO2 instead of the 3,000 to 4,000 kilowatt hours per ton of CO2 that the current generation of DAC technologies show. So we have to, there are ways to reduce the energy requirement, but we have to do that in parallel as proving out the technology, scaling it, and then building the business case.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, we're coming up to the hour now. There'll be no other questions in there about is Canada getting behind? This is from a gentleman from Ionado, which is a climate technology company in Canada. So, and then another question there about is people going to invest if they're from the Middle East, North Africa? Well, I think we've raised a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of interest in investment, but a lot of things need to be sorted out. But we'll finish on time. But thank you ever so much, Phil, Dick, and Charles, and thanks to everybody for watching. And we'll see you again very soon. Thank you. Cheers. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.